So the last time we were speaking, we were talking about how the first New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt in response to the Great Depression literally changed the physical landscape of the United States. You can go all over the country and find libraries, other buildings, murals by artists in post offices. There's one in Arlington, Texas. You can see a New Deal era mural at a post office there. Roads, bridges, hospitals, sewage systems, airports, and schools constructed as part of the New Deal. If you go to Dallas, you go to Fair Park, the old Art Deco style buildings that dominate Fair Park in Dallas, where the state fair is held every year, that was built during the celebration of the Texas Centennial, the 100th anniversary of the Texas Revolution. That was built as part of the New Deal projects. The Grand Coulee Dam in Washington State, pictured here. The Bonneville Dam near the border of Oregon and Washington State, the Boulder Dam near the Arizona and Nevada state line, the Triborough Bridge in New York City, and a 100-mile causeway connecting the Florida mainland to Key West were all New Deal projects. New Deal also created the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built 20 dams. And this is hard to imagine, but a great deal of America in the 1930s still did not have access to electricity. Homes still relied on candlelight by the 1930s, that long. And this brought light to those mostly rural parts in the Deep South and in the middle part of the country. It's really remarkable what they did. So these programs are not without opposition. And Franklin Roosevelt had vociferous critics, and I want to really emphasize an irony here. Franklin Roosevelt was a rich man who spent his whole life in privilege, part of a family defined by privilege. Franklin Roosevelt was not a revolutionary. He was actually trying to, like his cousin Teddy, to save capitalism from the capitalist. And he realized a crisis point had reached. And in fact, there was revolution in the air during the 1930s in a way I think there's never been in U.S. history, far more even than during the 1960s. And we've all heard about revolutionaries in the 1960s. Nevertheless, many rich people, the wealthy elites of the time, castigated Roosevelt as a traitor to his class. And in fact, there's substantial evidence verified by a general at the time, a general named Smedley Butler, who talked about the fact that there was a plot that never was realized to overthrow Roosevelt on the part of the industrialists, to actually have a coup, an overthrow of an elected president in this time. Roosevelt was attacked as a socialist. The bigger projects like the Progress Works Administration, the TVA, supposedly were socialist projects. But what they fail to appreciate is the psychological impact of these programs. And I mentioned this before. Roosevelt made use of the media of the time, and the most effective communications device of that era was radio. Television had been created experimentally, but it wasn't available at homes. That was, not a household item. And so the radio was where people listened to music, where they listened to drama, they listened to comedies, they listened to news. And Roosevelt took that medium, and he delivered regular addresses called fireside chats, where he communicated, number one, that he cared about people. People felt great reassurance and calm, and they felt that the president was developing plans and that these plans were progressing. And he was very effective at calming people. And all these programs that are created had a psychological impact. It gave thousands of people jobs, planting trees, building bridges, cleaning up garbage in parks, whatever work was available, artists painting murals, out of work writers, interviewing surviving former slaves and recording their stories, directors out of work putting on plays in distant locations for workers working in mines and other places. All of this gave people a sense that not only were they getting a paycheck, which was a lifesaver, but that things were being set up, programs were being set up that allowed them to survive. Now, I have to note the first New Deal had mixed results. After the National Recovery Act, codes were implemented, the economy picked up. Some people hoped for a quick end to the Depression. By the winter and spring of 1934, however, winter 1933, spring of 1944, indicators indicated another nosedive. Leading economic indicators pointed to another economic nosedive. Manufacturers began to ignore the National Recovery Act guidelines in terms of wages, working hours, commitments to not lay workers off. Government committees were set up to punish the violators, but unfortunately the Supreme Court, which was dominated by justices appointed by very conservative Republicans during the 1920s, ruled the NRA unconstitutional. And when that happened, Roosevelt had pretty much given up on the effectiveness of the NRA, and he let the agency die. He didn't really fight to revive it. Roosevelt, however cautious he was as a reformer, however, he did continue to suggest plans, etc. But I really want to emphasize this because when I was in high school, in earlier grades, history was presented as a series of people at the top. Presidents, military generals, industrial giants like Andrew Carnegie, etc. That's where history was, what great people did. And what was ignored was the degree to which people like us shape history. So much of history is caused by people at the bottom, resisting, fighting, organizing. And we see this even today. I have to make a criticism of some Democrats who sometimes brag about the Democratic Party being the party of civil rights and voting rights legislation, etc. The party itself didn't do that. Activists did that. The Democratic Party can be credited for responding to those demands, but they didn't do it in a vacuum. They had to be pushed. Democrats can claim the New Deal and some of the enduring legacies like Social Security that came with the New Deal. However, that again had to be forced on elites. They didn't just sit there and come up with these wise plans of their own. And so there's going to be so much activism in the 1930s that makes the New Deal much more effective, relieves some of the greatest suffering, and it's going to be ordinary people who are involved in this. Now, one of the most durable legacies of the New Deal is a provision of the National Industrial Recovery Act, Clause 7A. This is a real key piece of legislation. This grants workers the right, under federal law, to join labor unions of their own choosing, and it obligates employers to recognize unions once they're voted into existence by workers at a work site, and to negotiate with them in good faith. We have to be clear. Laws are one thing, reality is another. Businesses are going to outright violate the law. They're going to use intimidation and violence to undermine union organizing. One egregious thing, for instance, Walmart does today is when workers try to form a union at a Walmart, they will subject the employers or employees to forced sessions where they have to watch films explaining how terrible unions are. And if a union forms, they'll lose their jobs because the demands of the union will be unreasonable and they'll be unemployed. Propaganda forced on workers, required to watch this by their supervisors. So there's bad faith on the part of businesses. And by the way, a lot of companies in the 1930s will do this. a pretty common tactic in American businesses. They'll form company unions. They'll form a union that is under the control of the company, that supposedly is the voice of the workers, but of course manipulated from above. And they'll say, look, to the federal government, they'll say, there's a union here. Look, workers are represented. We're not suppressing labor activity. Here's this union here. Of course, it's one they started and they control. So there are those problems with this particular clause of the NIRA legislation. Nevertheless, this is a signal, and it leads to one of the greatest explosions of union activism in American history. Millions of workers are going to join unions. In 1933, 1934, United Mine Workers Union President John L. Lewis will declare, without ever actually clearing this with Franklin Roosevelt, he'll say, the president wants you to join a union. I have to be clear, Franklin Roosevelt was no more a big fan of unions than his cousin Teddy was. Nevertheless, he came to recognize the fact that union members were going to be a very big, important part of that New Deal coalition that will lead the Democrats to dominate American politics from the 1930s until really it begins to crack seriously in the 1980s. They still have control of the Congress in the 1970s. One of the most important parts of the Democratic coalition for 4 decades. So union members are going to mobilize unlike ever before. And they're going to hold 2,000 strikes across the country in 1934 alone. I have to point to another group that's ignored in American history. It makes people uncomfortable to talk about it. It even makes some historians uncomfortable to talk about it. And that's American communists. American communists were deeply involved in the labor activism of this era. And for a time, they take what I think is a really ineffective strategy. They avoid involvement in the big unions of the time, and primarily the American Federation of Labor, which is an organization made up of a bunch of individual unions. They insisted, the communists in America insisted for a time, that they had to have their own unions, what they call revolutionary unions, apart from the AFL. And they believed the AFL was collaborating with capitalists. The revolutionary unions, as name implied, wanted commitment to overthrowing capitalism. The AFL was not at all interested in that. And so they did their own activism, but they made an impact that was significant, and then eventually they will get involved with bigger, more mainstream unions, and they will influence and push those unions further to the left during the Depression. So for instance, they stage sit-ins at unemployment relief offices demanding greater payments. And here's one of the most important, significant contributions. The AFL is not doing anything on behalf of the unemployed specifically. The communists will, in fact, form what are called unemployed councils. And they will go out, and for instance, they'll go to the unemployed, and they'll persuade many of them to do something that had always been a problem for labor organizing. We talked about replacement workers. We talked about what union members call scabs, people who are without work, who when there's a strike will walk in and replace the striking workers. And so the company can keep operating, and so there's no need to negotiate. The communists actually become really effective at convincing unemployed workers to not do that, to tell them they're betraying their own interest. They also, and this is a big thing, the unemployed councils, they come to the aid of tenants when they're getting evicted. So I want to show you some pictures here of their activity of the unemployed councils organized by the Communist Party in the United States. First of all, it's unimaginable for many Americans today how big a movement communists were in the United States in the 1930s. This is a Communist Party rally in Philadelphia, May Day, we've talked about the history of May Day, 1935. They had the hammer and sickle there. They had their signs. This movement, draws a lot of people with varying levels of commitment. Sometimes people who aren't communists will come to communist rallies because they want to hear what they have to say, because they can recognize that there's a sickness in capitalism at that time, that capitalism as its function is in trouble. And some people are tempted by that. By the way, a lot of African American intellectuals get really drawn to the Communist Party at this time. Richard Wright, the novelist, for instance, who wrote some amazing pieces of literature. Black Boy was one, Native Son was another, books every educated person should read. He was drawn to the Communist Party at this time. We've talked about Du Bois and his radicalism in this era also. But I was talking about the unemployed councils. They publish newspapers. So they notify their people in their movement. This is a communist newspaper, by the way, in Washington State, 1935, Voice for Action. They're organizing people to stop evictions when people can no longer pay their rent or pay their mortgages, and they're going to be kicked out. And when there are evictions, sheriffs are involved in the process of kicking people out of their homes, removing their belongings. You see here a cartoon of the sheriff. He's depicted as King Kong, who's a giant ape in a hit movie in 1933. The movie was called King Kong. And the sheriff there, his name is Franson, is depicted as or rather, the Franson eviction. The sheriff never was. The Franson family is about to be evicted. That's the name of the family. The sheriff is depicted as a giant monster forcing people from their homes. And so here's what the communists do. They gather during these evictions in large numbers. They physically intervene. They try to prevent the sheriff physically and the deputies physically from evicting people from their residences when they can't afford the payments. And by the way, this is a big issue today because of the pandemic and the economic downturn. You see the crowds are able to get together. And anyway, what do they do when they get to these houses? If they can't stop the eviction, all the tenants' belongings are piled up in the yard or piled up in front of the apartment. And the communists will wait there. The family will wait there. And the moment the sheriff and the deputies leave, they pick up the furniture and they move it back into the housing. They help them set up the household again. And after a while, a lot of sheriff's departments who are forced to do the same eviction over and over again give up. And the owner of the property sometimes gives up. So the communists in this period show a remarkable amount of courage. And I mentioned this before. They, for instance, provide the defense team for the Scottsboro Boys, which are a group of young African Americans accused of raping two white women. And they're actually facing the death penalty. And the Communist Party provides the attorneys that keep the Scottsboro Boys from being executed. Well, we have this great strike wave in 1934. And by that year, communists, socialists, and other leftists have decided to join the big union, the big labor organization, the American Federation of Labor. And as I said, they push labor further left. And so you see them participating in a general strike in Toledo in 1934 at the electric auto light plant in Toledo, Ohio. Workers surround the factory. They block all the entries and exits. Management asks for police intervention. That results in a 7-hour battle in which workers are subjected to tear gas, high-powered water hoses, and gunfire. 2 workers die in this conflict. before the National Guard comes in and suppresses the strike. But a stand is made, and this is getting noticed, by the way, in Washington, D.C. Leftists also assume leadership of another general strike in San Francisco, July 16th to the 19th, 1934. This is a year in which longshoremen, people are working, at the docks, are fighting for control over hiring. They want to make sure that workers who are hired are workers who are likely to support labor rights. So they want control over that. They want higher wages. They want reduced working hours. There's a confrontation there in San Francisco. 1,000 police, battle strikers, 64 injuries and 2 deaths occur. But in this case, the International Longshoremen's Union wins most of their demands against tremendous odds. Now the largest, and this is really remarkable, because workers in the garment industry have always been amongst the most vulnerable workers. That's an industry that depends heavily on black labor, on women, on children, child labor. Textile workers, on September 1st, 1934, go on strike. 400,000 textile workers in mills from Maine, near the Canadian border, to Alabama walk off the job. This is a job action that bonds together New England Catholics with Southern Protestants, whites, and African Americans. It brings cotton production to a standstill. And this is a level of working class solidarity not seen since the populist movement. And we have some pictures here. Here are a couple of women. As I said, this is an industry. They're wearing the little signs on their back saying, "Get ready for the strike." You see the heavy hand of the state responding to these marching textile workers. Note the poverty of the town, the quality of the buildings here. These are people really striking. This, you're going to have a lot of National Guard action, police action that often turns violent to suppress this strike. And anyway, so this is the textile strike of 1934. And we're going to have riots in northern communities like Sayesville and Woonsocket, Rhode Island. You're going to have several deaths, hundreds of injuries, property is damaged, millions of dollars. Confrontations in the South are even harsher, as you'd expect. Hundreds of strikers are going to be imprisoned in barbed wire camps surrounded like barbed wire, almost like a concentration camp. By late September, leaders of the Textile Workers Union call off the strike. Workers, however, are going to vent their frustration at the ballot box. And the off-year elections are going to see some really interesting results. 1934 is not a presidential election year. It's an election year for Congress, for governor, for lieutenant governor, for state legislatures, etc. You're going to see candidates who are seen as conservative and hostile to labor just obliterated at the ballot box that election year. In Rhode Island, angry labor voters end the Republican Party's 30-year domination of the state. In South Carolina, working class voters unseat a conservative Democrat who's a governor. Coleman Blease is his name. He's part of an old family that has enjoyed great power in South Carolina since South Carolina was a colony. They replaced him with a former mill worker and a supporter of the New Deal. In 1934, Democrats are going to win 70% of the contested races in the House and Senate. And by the way, this group of Democrats is going to be far more liberal, far more supportive of bolder action with the New Deal than the previous Congress. No sitting president, by the way, had ever done so well in an off-year election. Usually, a president of one party gets elected, his party loses seats in the off-year election. He won 70% of the contested races in 1934, and there were 30 members of the new Congress who might actually be considered radicals, whose support for Roosevelt depended on his continued commitment to relief for the poor, the unemployed, workers, and farmers. And by the way, left-wing parties are going to do remarkably well at this state level. Small left-wing parties. The Communist Party grows dramatically in this period. Philip La Follette, who was part of a political dynasty. There was a Bob La Follette during the Progressive period. He's going to be elected governor of Wisconsin in 1934, 1936 as the head of what's called the Wisconsin Progressive Party, a party well to the left of the Democratic Party. La Follette calls for unemployment compensation, government loans to farmers to keep them afloat. In Minnesota, we're going to see the election of this man here. Let me raise the portrait there. This is a portrait of Floyd B. Olson. I want you to note something here. He's holding a radio microphone. These populists, these leftists, very often used electronic media at the time to reach the common person. Not every household had a radio, but in those neighborhoods where people didn't have radio, they would often gather in the house to listen to the news or listen to speeches, or they'd hang outside the window to listen in. And people would open their windows. And for instance, when Roosevelt did a fireside chat, you could hear his voice echo across the community because all the people with their empty windows or open windows. Olson leads what's called the Minnesota Farm Labor Party, which, by the way, still exists. And he's elected to the governorship in 1930, 1932, 1934, 1936. Olson comes out and says, capitalism is on trial for its life. That capitalism has essentially destroyed the life of workers. This is a really bold statement in an era where it was considered un-American at one point to question capitalism. In Washington, yet another radical party. The Commonwealth Builders elect both senators and half the state legislators in 1934 and 1936. And then this is particularly a significant moment. We talked about this man before, Upton Sinclair, the man who wrote the novel The Jungle, a socialist journalist during the Progressive era, who in his novel depicted the abuse and horrors faced by slaughterhouse workers in Chicago. He's going to run for office. He's going to run for governor in California. He's going to call his organization, his political organization, End Poverty in California, EPIC. And he's going to terrify the establishment, including Franklin Roosevelt, by the way, who secretly supports the Republican in this race. Sinclair is a socialist, and here's what he calls for. He calls for the state of California to seize land and close factories and to hand control of that land and the factories over to unemployed workers and farmers to see what they can do with it, to give them a livelihood. So conservatives in particular are going to be really terrified by this campaign. It's going to be a lot closer than anyone expects. It's a narrow race. Here's Upton Sinclair here. Picture him in this time period. And I want you to see the cartoons that are drawn to frighten people. There we go. Shall the stamp of Sinclairism crush California? Note the label there, communism. They're equating communism and Sinclairism. Note what the boot's about to crush. We have fleeing people as this giant boot that represents Sinclair's movement is about to crush small town America, especially churches, religion, and your property. Your property is going to be taken away from you. They're going to shut down your churches. They're going to battle God himself. So you have that cartoon. Here's another one that some more propaganda. And by the way, people with money did everything they could to depict. And I want you to note here, California in that period was normally dominated by the Republican Party. It had been since California became a state. And the Republican Party came into existence in the 1850s. Note that it says Democratic nest. They're saying the New Deal basically gave birth to these crazy socialists, and it's basically this bird is being fed by the California Democratic Party, and they parody EPIC, the name EPIC, End Poverty in California, Empty Promises in California. And note the branch there, it says out on a limb. This is not just the Democratic Party, but the state is going out on a dangerous limb. They try to depict him as a Joseph Stalin type communist. And people are aware at that point in the Soviet Union that Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, was holding show trials, purging hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of people during this period. And they said, this is what Upton Sinclair is calling for. Of course, that's ridiculous. There's a spectrum of left-wing politics. So what does this mean, all this left-wing activism? It means that there are, in fact, a sizable number of voters ready to abandon the Democratic Party if they're unwilling to take more dramatic reform measures, even to the point of socialism. The success of labor, including radical labor factions, left-wing parties, and a group of left-wing or what are called Depression-era demagogues, we'll talk about them later, men like Huey Long, convinces Roosevelt to move further left in his second term. His rhetoric moves further left, and in fact, policies are going to move further left, and that will lead to what comes to be known as the Second New Deal. Now, labor activism is going to play a key role in passage of a law called the Wagner Act in 1935, which is really an important piece of legislation. It's named after someone who's on the probably farthest liberal wing of the Democratic Party of that era, Robert F. Wagner. He's the son of a janitor. That law prohibits companies from blackballing workers who are engaged in union activity, which was a key weapon that a worker would get fired for trying to organize a union, and then they'd be put on a blacklist, and no one else would hire them. They faced a very difficult time getting a new job when they got fired for union activism. By the way, all this has come back again, this sort of thing. The Wagner Act creates a labor relations board empowered to supervise elections. When you're trying to organize a union, the workers vote on whether they want to be represented by that union. And the company is supposed to abide by that decision. And that union then represents all the workers in the work site. Now you can't have what it's, 1940s, they passed a law that says you can't be compelled to join a union. Nevertheless, under the Wagner Act, the union can represent all the workers in the work site. So, this is going to be a piece of legislation that makes Franklin Roosevelt nervous. He has a big chunk of his party still in that era, made up of Southern conservative segregationists. They're not only reactionary on their racial politics, but on their economic politics as well. Because the Democratic Party wins every election, every year, all the people with seniority in the Congress, with the Democratic Party dominating, are those Southern Democrats. And so Roosevelt is really reluctant to come out in favor of this law, and so he never endorses it. Nevertheless, the Congress passes it because of this new blood in the Congress, this new, much more liberal faction in the Democratic Party. Majorities pass in both the House and the Senate. Roosevelt quietly signs the law. Now, with this law, we have several unions, including the United Mine Workers and the American Clothing Workers, break off from the AFL. Which had been the dominant union since the basically diminishment of the Knights of Labor in the 1880s. And they're going to form a new organization. And these union leaders who break off from the AFL are frustrated with the AFL's disinterest in organizing what are called, quote-unquote, unskilled workers. The AFL had always focused on crafts, where jobs, workers in jobs where it's really hard to replace them because of the level of training involved. The United Mine Workers, President John L. Lewis and others are going to form the much more radical Congress of Industrial Organizations. And by the way, That organization is going to be far more interested in organizing black and brown workers, women. It will have, be much more supportive of civil rights. And it's going to innovate a tactic that's going to, for a time in the 1930s, really change the power dynamic between workers and their employers. That's called the sit-down strike. Members of the United Rubber Workers in 1936, affiliated with the CIO, are going to conduct a sit-in strike at a Goodyear rubber plant in Akron, Ohio. Now, why is this important? Well, what happens is, rather than going outside the factory or the mill or whatever and waving signs outdoors and protesting while the company brings in replacement workers, what you do in a sit-down strike is you literally stay in the factory, the workplace, and you refuse to leave. And that becomes tactically a really difficult thing for the employers, because if they send the police in, there's a possibility of destruction of equipment. As I say, the optics aren't good to the outside world. And so with this Goodyear rubber plant sit-down strike, the company's unable to reopen the plant, and they agree to most of the workers' demands. Now, one of the most famous sit-down strikes in the history of America is conducted by the United Auto Workers, another CIO affiliate. They're going to sit down at a General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan. It's going to be during the winter. They're going to occupy the plant for a month. Management is going to turn off the heat. The strikers persist. GM sends police into the plant. There is a battle. Workers are shot. 14 workers are shot. They're injured. They refuse to leave after they're injured. They stay with their brothers in the strike. And the governor of Michigan, Frank Murphy, after the violence used by GM, using police, mobilizes the National Guard, not to help GM, but to provide physical protection to the workers. And at that point, GM relents, and that becomes a big victory for the labor movement that actually sets a precedent where auto workers in America actually are able to enter the middle class. And that becomes the case until they begin moving auto manufacturing overseas, which is a phenomenon you begin to see in the 70s and particularly in the 1980s. By the way, in 1939, the United States Supreme Court rules that sit-down strikes are illegal. We've talked about how corporations are able to bend the law to serve the rich and powerful, but by that point, the CIO had 3 million members. So one more point, and then I'll be done for this segment. Most of the working class did not blame Roosevelt personally as the Depression drags on. Instead, they blame his conservative critics and big business. And so when Roosevelt begins his campaign for re-election in 1936, he's going to have a considerable amount of wind behind his back. This will be a key election. Will Roosevelt be re-elected? Will the New Deal continue? What will the second New Deal involve? And then what happens to the future of the government and its relationship to people? We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about people, again, who are making demands further left than Roosevelt wants to go in the next segment. Thank you.